The morning sun touched the glass walls of a tall office building, shining bright and cold, while people in neat suits hurried inside with polished shoes and confident faces, and among them came a woman who looked very different. She wore a plain dress, her shoes were worn but clean, her hair tied simply back, no makeup on her face, no jewelry on her hands, nothing expensive to show, and in her arms she carried only a small folder. Not even a bag, not even a laptop, just that folder. And when she walked into the lobby, people looked at her. Some whispered softly, some laughed quietly, because to them she did not look like someone who belonged here. Not in this big office, not in this place of power. She waited for the elevator, standing next to young men and women dressed in sharp suits, their ties perfect, their perfume strong, their confidence louder than words. And she stood still, calm, not saying anything, only holding her folder close, and when the elevator opened they all stepped inside, pressing the button for the same floor, the top floor where the interviews were taking place. And during that silent ride she felt their eyes on her, judging her, questioning her, wondering why she was even there. And though she noticed every glance, every smile that carried hidden laughter, she said nothing. The doors opened and the group walked out together, down the hall where golden letters on the wall spelled the name of the company, a company that was famous, respected, known for its strict hiring and impossible standards. And this woman with her simple look walked behind the others, her steps slow, her face peaceful, her folder pressed against her chest like a shield. And when they reached the waiting area for candidates, chairs lined up in a row, she sat down quietly while the others laughed, compared their resumes, showed off their achievements, speaking loudly so everyone could hear how great they were. And every now and then one of them looked at her and shook their head with a grin, as if she had entered the wrong place. The receptionist at the desk called the first name, a young man with shining shoes and an expensive watch. He walked in proudly, shoulders straight, head high, and the others clapped his back with fake support. Then sat down again to wait for their turn, and the woman stayed quiet, her eyes resting on the floor, her hands holding the folder, her lips closed but curved slightly upward, as if she knew something no one else did. One of the young women sitting near her leaned toward another candidate and whispered just loud enough, saying she must have come for the wrong interview, maybe for cleaning work, not for a corporate position, and the others chuckled, hiding their laughter behind their hands. But the woman heard, she always heard, yet she did not reply. She only sat with her calm smile, her eyes soft, her breathing steady, as if nothing in the world could shake her. Minutes passed slowly. Candidates walked in and out, some looking nervous, some smiling with false victory. But every time one came back, they looked at the woman again, their eyes filled with the same disbelief. Why was she still sitting there? Why was she wasting her time? And still she stayed, patient, gentle, silent, like a quiet storm waiting for the right moment to break. Finally, the receptionist called her name, a name so plain and common that even the sound of it made some of the candidates laugh quietly, covering their mouths but not enough to hide the mockery. And she rose from her seat, adjusting her simple dress, holding her small folder close, and walked toward the interview room, her steps soft but strong, every move filled with a dignity that nobody in that waiting room could understand. Not yet. The door opened and she stepped inside. The panel of interviewers looked up, their eyes scanning her quickly from head to toe, from her simple clothes to her old shoes. And in their minds they had already made a decision, already formed their judgment before she even sat down. But she did not seem to care. She only gave them a gentle nod, her face calm, her presence almost unsettling in its silence. She sat down, placed the folder on the table, folded her hands in her lap and waited, her eyes meeting theirs with a quiet confidence. And for a brief moment the room felt heavier, as if something was different, as if they could sense there was more to her than what they saw. But the feeling passed quickly, and one of the panelists cleared his throat, leaned forward, and asked the first question in a voice filled with doubt, ready to dismiss her before she could even begin. The story of this woman was only starting, and already the air in the room was thick with unspoken words, hidden laughter and silent judgment. Yet deep inside her eyes there was a spark, small but burning, that promised something none of them were prepared to witness, something that would change everything they thought they knew about this interview, this company, and this so-called simple woman. The woman sat across from the interview panel, her folder resting quietly on the table, and the room was filled with an uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, the kind of silence that carries hidden laughter, though no one dares to show it openly. And the interviewers exchanged quick glances, their eyes saying more than their lips, eyes that already judged her, eyes that whispered she did not belong here. One of the panelists, a man with a sharp suit and colder eyes, leaned forward and asked her to introduce herself, his tone flat, his voice carrying no warmth, and she spoke softly but clearly, her words simple, without fancy vocabulary, without decoration, only honest. And as she spoke about her past experiences, about the small roles she had taken, about the simple work she had done, the panelists raised their brows. Some of them even smiled at each other, a mocking smile that said she was wasting their time. She explained how she worked hard in places where no one noticed her, how she had learned through trial and error, how she never gave up even when people told her she was not good enough. And while her story was filled with struggle and survival, the panel only heard ordinary words, nothing flashy, nothing to impress them, and so they wrote quick notes not about her skills, but about how unsuitable she looked for this job. Another interviewer, a woman with perfectly styled hair and a polished voice, asked her a complicated question, a question filled with technical terms and difficult phrases. And when the woman answered in her own plain way, simple but true, the interviewer covered her mouth as if to hide a smile, then said in a voice that dripped with false sweetness, "Are you sure you applied for the right company? Because this is not a charity. This is a global firm and we only hire the best." And her words carried sharp edges cutting through the air, making the other panelists chuckle quietly. The simple woman looked at them calmly. Her face did not change. She did not frown, she did not argue. She only gave a small smile and nodded gently, as if she had heard these same words many times before in her life. And then she said softly, "Thank you for asking." And her answer confused them, because they expected anger. They expected nervousness. They expected her to stumble and break, but she remained steady, and that made her even more unusual in their eyes. Meanwhile, outside the interview room, the other candidates were waiting, sitting on the chairs, whispering and laughing among themselves, some leaning close to the door trying to catch words. And when they heard the sarcastic tone of the interviewer inside, they exchanged knowing looks, shaking their heads with pride, as if they had already won the job, because in their minds this simple woman could never stand a chance against them. Inside, the panel continued with more questions, each one designed not to test her knowledge but to trap her, to make her look foolish, and yet each time she answered with the same calm tone, her words short, her sentences plain, and her eyes steady. And though her answers lacked the polished shine the others expected, there was a truth inside them, a kind of honesty that was rare in this room. But the panel could not see it, blinded by their own pride and prejudice. At one point, the man in the sharp suit leaned back in his chair and whispered to another panelist, loud enough for her to hear, saying, "She is too simple. She does not even understand half of this." And the others laughed quietly, trying not to let it sound too obvious. But the woman heard every word, still she did not react. She did not let their mockery touch her calm. Her hands stayed folded, her posture straight, her eyes clear, and in that silence she seemed stronger than they realized. The panel soon grew restless, impatient because they had already decided the outcome. They wanted to end this interview quickly, and one of them finally closed the folder of her resume with a careless motion, saying, "We will let you know, thank you for coming." And there was no respect in his tone, only dismissal, only arrogance, as if her presence had been nothing more than a small interruption in their busy day. The woman stood up slowly, picked up her small folder, gave them a soft smile, and thanked them once more, her voice carrying no bitterness, no fear, only calm grace. And she walked to the door quietly, her steps light, her back straight, and just before she opened it, she turned slightly, her eyes meeting theirs for a brief moment, and in that glance there was something they could not understand. Something that made their laughter fade for a second, though they could not explain why. As she walked out of the room, the candidates outside looked at her with smirks, whispering to each other that she was finished, that she had no chance, that she should never have come. But she ignored their words, her face still calm, her smile still present, and she returned to her seat, waiting silently, as if she knew something none of them did, as if she was holding a secret so powerful that one day it would silence every laugh and every cruel whisper in that room. The interview room remained tense after the woman left, the panel still holding their mocking smiles, writing quick notes that meant nothing, already preparing to move on to the next candidate, their minds certain she was not worth another thought. But then the door opened again, and this time it was not a candidate. It was a man in a dark suit, tall, confident, with silver in his hair and authority in every step, and the moment he entered the room, silence fell like a heavy curtain. The panel straightened in their chairs, their laughter gone in an instant because this man was not ordinary. He was one of the most senior executives in the company, someone whose words carried weight, someone whose presence demanded respect. And without wasting a second, he turned to the simple woman who had just stepped aside near the door, his face softening, his voice warm as he said, "Good to see you again, ma'am. It has been some time." Every person in the room froze, their eyes wide, their hearts skipping beats. The panelists looked at each other in confusion, shock spreading across their polished faces, while the candidates outside strained to hear, wondering why a senior executive would call that plain woman ma'am, why his voice carried respect, why his eyes showed familiarity, and the room that once held laughter now held fear and disbelief. The simple woman smiled gently, nodding her head as if greeting an old friend, and the executive walked closer, shaking her hand with genuine warmth, asking about her journey, asking if everything was comfortable, speaking as if she was the guest of honor, while the panelists who had mocked her only minutes ago sat frozen, their pens still in their hands, their notebooks open yet meaningless, because in that moment they realized something was very wrong with their judgment. The executive then turned to the panel and asked, "How has the interview process been so far?" And his question was polite but his eyes sharp, searching their faces for honesty, and none of them dared to answer right away, their voices caught in their throats, their pride collapsing inside them, until finally one cleared his throat and said weakly, "It is going well, sir. We are evaluating each candidate carefully," but his words trembled, his tone unsteady, because the truth of their behavior was heavy on their conscience. The simple woman stood calmly, her folder still in her hand, her eyes quiet but powerful, and in that silence everyone began to sense that she was not here for an interview, that her presence carried a purpose beyond what they had imagined. But no one dared to ask, no one dared to speak, for the room was no longer theirs, it was hers. The executive gave a small smile, looked at the panel and said, "Allow me to introduce her properly. This is not a candidate. This is the owner of the company." And with those words the ground beneath them seemed to break. The wall seemed to close in and every face turned pale. Every laugh that had escaped their lips earlier now turned into regret. Gasps filled the air. Some covered their mouths, some lowered their eyes in shame. The candidates outside who heard the words leaned forward in shock, their jaws dropping, their confidence shattered, because the woman they mocked for being too simple, too plain, too ordinary, was in truth the very person who created this empire, the very person who built the name that shone in golden letters on the wall outside. The woman looked around the room, her eyes meeting each face one by one, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with a calm strength that made their hearts pound, and she said softly, "I came here not to take a job, but to see how my people treat strangers, to see if respect in this place is real or only for those who look powerful." And her words sank deep, slicing through their arrogance like a sharp blade, leaving silence so heavy no one could breathe. One of the panelists, the man in the sharp suit who had laughed at her the loudest, lowered his head, his voice shaking as he muttered an apology, but his words were weak, hollow, for he knew no apology could erase the look in her eyes, the truth of what she had witnessed, and he felt smaller than ever before, crushed by the weight of his own behavior. The simple woman then placed her folder gently on the table, opening it to reveal not a resume but documents of ownership, proof that the company was indeed hers, papers signed, stamped, undeniable, and the panelists stared at the truth before them, their pride broken, their arrogance turned to fear, their laughter turned to shame. Outside in the waiting area, whispers spread like fire. Candidates who once mocked her now sat stiff. Their earlier pride vanished, and though they wanted to hide, they could not escape the reality that the woman they had judged so harshly was their potential employer, the one who could decide their future with a single word, and the air grew heavy with regret. The woman looked back at the panel, her voice calm yet strong, and she said, "You tested me with your questions, now I will test you with mine." And her words promised a storm of truth, a storm of justice, and no one in that room was ready for what was about to come. The room was frozen in silence, the panelists afraid to breathe, the candidates outside whispering in shock, and the woman stood tall, no longer just a candidate, but the very owner of the company they thought belonged only to people with sharp suits and expensive words. And her eyes moved slowly across the room, resting on each face, calm yet powerful, soft yet heavy, making every person lower their gaze. She spoke in a voice that was gentle yet firm, like water flowing over stone, saying, "I wanted to see with my own eyes how my staff treats those who walk in without glitter or shine, how they treat those who look ordinary, because I know too well what it feels like to be judged for what you wear, for what you look like, for what you do not have. And as she spoke, the panelists shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their hands trembling on their papers, their pride shrinking with every word. She continued, saying, I was born in a small village, in a house with a leaking roof and walls that shook with every storm. My father worked in the fields. My mother stitched clothes late into the night. We did not have riches. We did not have comfort. But we had honesty. We had hard work. And those were the only treasures I carried with me. And while she spoke, the room seemed to travel back into her memories, seeing the dirt roads, the flickering lamps, the sound of her mother's tired sighs, and the quiet tears she had hidden as a child. The candidates outside leaned closer to the door, their earlier smirks now gone, their faces pale with guilt, as her words reached their ears, painting pictures of a life far from the shiny offices they sat in. And the panelists inside could no longer hide their shame, because the very woman they dismissed so quickly had walked a path they could not survive for even a day. She told them how she had been mocked many times before, in schools where teachers thought she was too slow, in markets where people laughed at her plain clothes, in early jobs where supervisors ignored her, and in every step she heard the same word, simple. They said she was too simple, not smart enough, not sharp enough, but she never let their words chain her spirit. Instead, she carried them like stones, heavy but useful, building steps that led her higher each time they tried to push her down. Her voice grew steadier, her eyes brighter, as she said, I started selling handmade goods. Walking miles to markets with baskets heavier than my shoulders could bear, I failed many times. People cheated me. People mocked me again, but I did not stop, because every failure taught me a lesson no book could give. And slowly I learned to trade, I learned to save, I learned to grow, until the small basket became a small shop, and the small shop became many, and one day those shops turned into this very company, the one you sit in today, the one you thought belonged to someone else. The executive beside her nodded with respect, his eyes filled with admiration, and the panelists could not meet her gaze, their earlier arrogance burning away under the weight of her truth, and one of them whispered softly, We did not know. But even as the words left his lips, he realized they sounded weak, empty, because ignorance was no excuse for cruelty. The woman looked at them and said, That is the point. You never know who sits before you. You never know the pain they carry, the strength they hide, the story they lived. Yet you choose to judge based on clothes, based on faces, based on what you think is success. And she shook her head gently, her eyes sad yet strong, and every person in the room felt the sting of her words deep in their hearts. The candidates outside shifted nervously, their earlier laughter echoing in their minds like a cruel ghost, haunting them, reminding them of what they had said, and some wished they could vanish. Some wished they could take back their words. But it was too late. The truth had been revealed, and the woman they mocked now stood taller than any of them could ever dream. She placed her hand on the folder she had brought, saying, This folder does not carry a resume. It carries the proof of ownership, the proof that I built this empire with nothing but sweat, struggle, and faith. And she opened it again, showing the documents, the signatures, the seals, undeniable, unshakable, and the panelists stared as if looking at their own reflection, seeing how small their pride looked against her mountain of resilience. Her story was not told with anger, not with revenge, but with calm dignity. Every word she spoke was like a mirror showing the truth, and in that truth was a lesson too powerful to ignore, a lesson that burned through every false smile and every shallow judgment, reminding them that greatness often wears simple clothes, that strength often walks quietly, and that the ones you mock may one day be the ones you answer to. The air in the room was heavy, every person struggling to look at the woman. Their earlier pride shattered, their confidence gone, and yet she stood calm, her presence filling the space, her voice steady like the sound of truth carried by the wind. And though she spoke softly, every word struck like thunder in their hearts. She looked at the panel, then at the door where the waiting candidates sat stiff in silence, and she said, All my life people called me simple. They used that word like a weapon. They thought it meant weak. They thought it meant small. But I carried that word like a seed. I planted it in my heart, watered it with my struggle, and watched it grow into something they could never imagine. And now here I stand, simple as you call me, yet strong enough to build the very roof over your heads. The panelists shifted uneasily, their hands shaking, their eyes glued to the floor, for they knew she had caught them in their arrogance, and one of them tried to speak, but his voice cracked. No words would form. because shame weighed down on his tongue like chains, and the silence that followed was louder than any answer they could have given. The woman stepped closer to the table, her eyes never blinking, her voice calm yet powerful, and she said, "You see a plain dress and you laugh, you see old shoes and you whisper, you hear simple words and you think the mind behind them is small. But let me tell you something. Success is not stitched in expensive suits. It is not carried in fancy bags, it is not sprayed with perfume. Success is carved into the soul of those who never give up, of those who fight when the world laughs, of those who rise each time they are pushed down." Her words spread through the room like fire, burning away the false pride that once filled it, and the candidates outside listened with wide eyes, realizing that every shallow smile they had shown earlier was now their own shame, every mocking whisper now a stain on their hearts, and they could not escape the truth that had been placed before them. She continued, saying, "I wanted to test not your knowledge, not your skill, but your humanity. I wanted to see if the culture of this company had grown beyond shallow judgment, if my people had learned to respect others no matter how they look. And sadly, what I saw today tells me that the lesson is still not learned." And her voice carried no anger, only disappointment, which cut even deeper than rage. The executive standing by her folded his arms, his eyes moving over the panel, his silence adding weight to her words, and the panelists sat frozen like statues, their pride broken, their arrogance melted away, their thoughts filled with regret that came too late, and none of them dared to raise their head to meet her eyes. She then told them about the nights she spent hungry while building her dream, the years when she walked barefoot to save every coin, the times when she was rejected and laughed at, and how each of those moments shaped her into the person standing before them. And she said, "I know the pain of being judged by appearance, and I never wanted it to live inside this company. Yet here I stand watching it unfold in my own walls," and her voice trembled slightly, not with weakness but with sorrow, sorrow that this place she built was stained with the same cruelty she had fought so hard to rise above. The candidates outside were silent now, no longer whispering, no longer laughing. Some looked down at their hands, some fidgeted nervously, all wishing they could hide from her gaze, but the walls carried her voice to them, making sure none could escape the lesson, and the receptionist at the desk, who had earlier smiled with judgment, now sat stiff, realizing she too had been part of the cruel game. The woman walked slowly to the center of the room, her steps measured, her presence unshakable, and she said, "Success without kindness is failure in disguise. Power without respect is weakness hiding behind a suit. If you cannot see the worth of a person beyond their clothes, then you will never see the true value of this world." And her words left every listener breathless, their hearts heavy with guilt and awakening. She placed her hand on the table, leaned forward slightly, and said, "Remember this, the one you mock today may be the one you serve tomorrow. The one you laugh at may be the one who decides your fate. So treat every person with dignity, for you never know the storm they have walked through to stand before you." And her eyes glistened with both pain and strength, leaving no doubt that her words came from the deepest truth of her soul. The room was silent, the shame so heavy that even the ticking of the clock felt loud, and as she stepped back, her presence seemed larger than ever, her figure no longer that of a simple woman but of a giant carved by struggle, and every person in that space knew they would carry her lesson for the rest of their lives, whether they wanted to or not. The room was wrapped in silence, a silence so deep that even the sound of breathing felt loud. The panelists lowered their heads. The candidates outside sat frozen, and the woman stood tall in the center, her eyes filled with strength, her presence unshakable, and though she looked simple, she carried a power greater than the suits and ties around her. She let the silence linger, letting it press down on every heart, letting it remind them of the weight of their actions. And then she spoke, her voice soft but strong, saying, "I did not come here today to embarrass anyone. I came to remind you of something greater than money or titles. I came to remind you that respect should not be bought with appearance. It should be given freely to every human being because without respect, success means nothing." Her words spread like a wave, crashing into every listener, shaking the walls of pride that had stood so tall before, and the panelists felt their eyes sting, some with shame, some with regret, and the candidates outside leaned forward, their hearts heavy with guilt, for they knew her words were not only for the panel but for them as well. She continued, her voice steady, her face calm, saying, "I have walked through fire, I have carried the weight of hunger, I have felt the sting of rejection, and I have been mocked for being simple. Yet here I stand, not broken, not defeated, because strength is not built in comfort. Strength is built in pain, and the greatest victory is not when you rise alone but when you lift others as you rise. The executive beside her watched in silence. His eyes filled with admiration, and the room seemed smaller now, as if it could not contain the truth she carried. And the woman walked slowly to the table where the panel sat, her hands resting lightly on the wood, her gaze moving across their faces, and she said, "I will not punish you. I will not fire you, because punishment teaches fear, but I want you to learn respect. I want you to carry this shame as a mirror that will remind you every time you see another person walk through that door, that they deserve dignity, no matter how simple they appear." Her words cut through them like light in the darkness, and the panelists nodded slowly, their faces pale, their pride gone, and the receptionist outside lowered her head, her cheeks burning with regret, and the other candidates sat stiff, their earlier laughter haunting them, echoing in their ears, and none of them dared to speak. None dared to move, for they knew they had all been part of the test and they had all failed. The woman then straightened, her calm smile returning, and she said, "I built this company not with money but with belief, not with luxury but with sacrifice, and I will not let it become a place where people are judged by clothes, by shoes, by empty appearances. This company will stand for respect, for hard work, for honesty," and her words rang like a bell, clear and pure, leaving no doubt that her command was final and absolute. She turned toward the door, her steps slow, her presence still filling the room, and as she walked past the waiting candidates, they lowered their eyes, unable to meet her gaze, their hearts pounding with shame and fear, and yet in that moment some felt something deeper, a seed of change planted inside them, a promise to never repeat the same mistake. And though the air was heavy, it carried hope. The woman paused near the door, turned slightly and looked back one last time, her eyes meeting theirs, and she said softly, "Remember this, greatness is not in how the world sees you, it is in how you see others. Treat every person with kindness, because the crown of respect shines brighter than the crown of wealth." And her words lingered in the air like a prayer. Like a law carved into stone, she opened the door, the light from the hallway spilling in, wrapping around her like a halo, and for a moment she looked like more than a business owner. She looked like a teacher, a leader, a force that no mockery could ever defeat. And as she stepped out, the sound of her quiet footsteps echoed like thunder in their hearts. The panel remained seated, their notebooks useless, their pens still, their eyes wet with shame, and the candidates outside sat frozen, realizing they had just witnessed a lesson they would carry forever. And though no one spoke, every mind repeated her final words, every heart felt the power of her truth, and every soul knew they had been changed. And so the woman walked away, her simple dress moving gently with each step, her head held high, her smile calm, leaving behind a silence filled with regret, with awe, with lessons that would never be forgotten. And as the door closed behind her, the company she built stood taller than ever, not because of wealth or power, but because of the wisdom of a simple woman who showed the world what true greatness really means.